another APIsec University webinar. Hope you're all doing well, as always. Love to hear from you in the chat. Looks like Matthias is first. And let us know where you're joining us from. And I'm really pleased to have you here. And I'm extra pleased to have Ejona Preci here from Free Now, and joining us all the way from Germany. That's why it's, I was going to say bright and early here in San Francisco, but it's actually really dark still. And we're still slightly flooded. You might have heard about what we've been going through. But at any rate, today's session, we're talking about governance. And I know that's not like the sexiest topic for everybody, but it's actually super important. And talking to Ejona in the last few weeks, it's actually incredibly interesting. And there's a lot to it. And if you do it right, it can be a real business enabler, right? And so, Ejona, thank you for being here. Thanks for sharing your expertise with us today.
Thank you so much for inviting me to speak on this important topic, Dan. And I'm really super excited to be here and connect with the amazing community of APIsec University.
Yeah, thank you. We love our community here. And hey, there's some Cincinnati, Ghana, UAE, India. I mean, we got people all over the world here.
All over the world, yeah.
It's really fabulous. All right, let me try to give you some justice. You have an amazing background, Ejona. There's a lot to cover. First of all, you've probably seen Ejona online, right? She's got incredible presence on LinkedIn. She's got a fantastic podcast. I really highly recommend. She's the principal manager for cybersecurity risk at Free Now, which is a ride-hailing app for all of Europe for the most part, I believe. I've used Free Now in Paris. Also the president of the Women in Cybersecurity in Germany. She has incredible accolades, recognized as one of the top 44 cyber power women, shortlisted for Cybersecurity Woman of the Year last year. Somehow finds time for her podcast. Let me throw that up here because I want you all to check it out. There's her Cyberstar Talks podcast. Yeah, please click away on it. It's a really great. She has fantastic speakers and guests and talks about interesting things. And what else can I say? You should follow her. You should follow Ejona. She's really a great person.
Thank you so much for your kind introduction, Dan. I feel really pumped up from the kind words. I started my podcast 1.5 years ago because I was having a great network of people from all over the world, like experts in cybersecurity field. And I decided to take these offline discussions to online so that everybody could benefit from it. Yeah. So I'll be happy if you join me on my monthly podcast and also share your feedback.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, let me see. Now I'm getting lost in how to share screen. No. All right. Why can't I figure out how to turn off this thing? Well, at any rate, we are going to look at our beautiful faces here for the podcast here, because I cannot figure out how to turn off. This is ridiculous. Why can't I turn off the materials? At any rate. Okay, so I want to dive right in here, Ejona. And we're talking about hacking into API governance. And I know for a lot of people, governance is kind of like, it's like taxes. It's just something you got to do. No one likes it, right? But let's start off with what is governance? Like, help us understand, like, give us some framework about what is governance? What should we be thinking about when we're talking about governance?
Yeah, so before we jump into the cybersecurity governance, let's try to paint a broad picture of the main areas in cybersecurity. So cybersecurity field is a very diverse and in terms of also organizational structures. And honestly, it changes from one company to another. I've seen different organizational structures of cybersecurity, but in my view, there are two big pieces of the puzzle. It is cybersecurity operations on one hand and cybersecurity governance. So cybersecurity operations typically include what we know as SOC, Security Operations Center, penetration testing, incident management, and the management of threats and vulnerabilities. So it is more focused on the hands-on day-to-day activities, which involve protecting the organization and, of course, its assets. While cybersecurity governance is part of the big governance domain of every organization. And typically in the cybersecurity governance part is the GRC included, which is governance, risk, and compliance. So it involves not just the monitoring and detection, but also ensures compliance with policies and regulations. It also manages risks and, of course, conducts also cybersecurity audits and IT audits to check whether the controls are effectively mitigating the risk. So these two branches can be further divided into specialized teams or functions, such as red teams, for example, which is the offensive security, blue team, defensive security, and also recently there is also a new term known as purple teams, which is sort of a blend between offensive and defensive teams. Other organizational structures can go to a lower granularity, which comprises application security, network defense, intrusion detection, intrusion prevention, incident response, endpoint protection, risk management, and so on. So it can really go very granular. But as I said, the most important part to make, differentiate between is to differentiate between governance and operations. So cybersecurity governance is typically we are very similar to lawyers, I would say.
Yeah.
So we keep an eye on the laws, legislations, standards that the company has to comply with, and also on the best practices, and incorporate those into company security posture.
Well, I think one of the main things that I got out of it, and hold on, I think I finally figured out how to do this. Hey, there we go. Is that it's not just like a bunch of rules and regulations. It can actually be an enabler of the company, of the business, right?
Absolutely.
And so I know we're going to talk about that. But all right, so you've given us kind of an idea of like what is governance, right? And it's pretty big, right? It's a bigger topic than I realized. I used to think it's policies and rules and people watching what you did.
Yeah, that's what most of the people think about it, but actually it includes also much more than just policies and procedures. And I'm going to take a deep dive on each of these later. But actually, the most important part is setting up a set of standards, policies, procedures, and methodologies in place in order to guide how an organization manages and protects its information assets in terms of course, CIA, confidentiality, integrity, availability. So these are the three main pillars of information security. So it is about setting the direction and establishing the rules of implementing safeguards across the entire organization. The first question cybersecurity governance teams should figure out is what are the legislations and standards that the organization must comply with.
So those are like non-negotiable, right? You can't do business if you aren't PCI compliant or
exactly
whatever it might be. Yeah.
And the second question is what are the standards, the best practices that the organization wants to comply with? And here is where the prioritization kicks off. Because with limited resources, we can't and we shouldn't protect everything. We are not supposed to protect everything. Therefore, the first and the most critical step in the cybersecurity governance is know your assets. Identify what are the assets that the company operates and classify them according to confidentiality, for example, or integrity of the information or the availability in case of systems. And then we have a clear view of what is critical and where our resources should be allocated to.
Well, and then know your assets. I mean, here we're talking to an API audience here, right? And clearly, for API purposes, right? That's got to mean what APIs do you have? What data does it have access to? What are the controls? What are the possible ways that it could be abused? What kind of exposure could it create? I mean, that all fits here.
Absolutely. Having an inventory of all APIs, be it internal or external, whatever, we need to have an inventory and also classify them because not every API has the same criticality for the company.
Right.
So there might be an API just exchanging public data, So of course that needs less protection than an API, which is transmitting confidential information or even secret information or PII data. That's another hot topic.
Yeah, indeed. So I kind of interrupted you. All right. So you were talking about like know your assets. That was step one or the first of 3 pillars.
Exactly. So actually, let's talk about the main tasks of cybersecurity governance.
Okay.
First of all, as I said, we need to craft policies, procedures, guidelines, methodologies to define how the organization will protect the information assets. An example of such policies can be acceptable use of assets, software development policy, incident response, user management, change management, many others. And recently also AI security policy. I've seen this, like many companies are already adopting policies for AI as well. And I think we are right on time for that. So then the second part is risk management. It's about identifying, assessing, and mitigating risks related to organizations' information assets or processes, because a risk assessment can be asset-based, but it can be also process-based. So this involves continuous risk assessment and the implementation of strategies to mitigate those identified risks. Another task for cybersecurity governance is compliance and legal requirements. So we need to identify what are those standards or legislation that we need to comply with, and examples of that can be GDPR, for example, HIPAA, PCI DSS, NIS2 directive, which is being introduced in the EU recently, and of course many others. Another important component is also strategic alignment. So we need to make sure that our cybersecurity strategies are actually in line with the business goals and objectives. And I think that's crucial because we are, as any other unit in the company, and our mission is actually to achieve business objectives eventually.
Yeah, right.
And to create value for the business. So this is a sort of discussion between value creation and value protection, because most of people think that we are value protectors. But I would say we are first value creators and then value protectors.
Well, I think we were talking about this concept of guardrails, right?
Absolutely.
Like, I don't know if this is a real quote or not, from some Formula One driver, right? And they were asking why he was able to go so fast around the circuit, and the answer was, well, because I have fantastic brakes, right?
Oh,
It gives, like with control, you can go even faster, right? And I think that's a concept that maybe gets lost.
Absolutely.
On governance.
And eventually, brakes are accelerators. You can't go fast without brakes.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And I love seeing the questions come in here already. Thank you, everybody. We're definitely going to try to touch on all of them. But you talked about regulations, right? Like you got to know what regulation, and some are very explicit, right? Like PCI, right? Yeah. It's very detailed. You got to do this and you got to do this, and you have to encrypt and you have to authenticate. And
I really like it because it's like straightforward, and there is no chance that you could misinterpret it or something.
Well, and then you have like an annual audit, right? Like someone comes in and they check you. And then
so let's take an example.
Sorry?
Let's take an example about, let's say we are tasked to implement the new version of PCI DSS, version 4, which is going to be effective 31st of March, 2024. So we need to adopt this new standard in the company, but we assume that we are already compliant with the standard with a version 3.2.1, right? So I assume that most of the people here might be familiar with PCI DSS, but for those who are not, it stands for the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard. And this is a standard designed to reduce payment card fraud by increasing security controls around cardholder data. It is not a certification in the traditional sense, and we have to highlight this. It is not like ISO certification. So companies don't get certified for PCI DSS. It is a set of security standards which are designed to ensure that companies that accept or process or store or transmit credit card information maintain a secure environment for those cardholder data.
Yeah.
So companies that handle credit card data are required to comply with these standards, obviously, and compliance is validated annually by an external auditor for larger service providers and through a self-assessment questionnaire for smaller companies. So they don't need to be audited. There are some layers of the number of transactions that every company does, and based on those numbers, you obviously fall into one of those layers. Yeah. So at the end of the assessment, companies get a statement of compliance, showing them that they are compliant with this standard. So to get back to our example, let's say we need to implement the new standard version 4.0, and we know that this version has 12 requirements, which can be broken down into, if I'm not wrong, 250 controls. And the version 3.2.1 will be retired on 31st of March. So how do we handle this? Well, it goes through the InfoSec governance, of course. They are the first who take this topic and analyze it. So the CISO, in most of the cases, the CISO is the one who handles this, will need to make a gap analysis to see what are the controls that we have in place and what are the new requirements in the new version. And also perform a risk assessment, because for every control that we are introducing to our control catalog, we need to have a relevant risk, because a control exists either to mitigate a risk or to exploit an opportunity. There is no other way how we can introduce controls in our environment. So this gap analysis is crucial to know what we have in place in order to avoid any duplication or overlapping of controls. Because, large companies might have thousands of controls in place. Yeah. And obviously you can't remember everything. And we might end up, if there is no gap analysis, we might end up in duplication of controls. And of course, that will cause security overheads.
Yeah. Yeah.
So this is pretty much in the structure, how it goes. And of course, every single one of these steps that I mentioned has a specific process to follow. Yeah. But I think this is the most.
No, that's helpful. And I'm going to throw David's comment up here, if I can find it. Where are you, David? Let's make this even more concrete, right? Is this talk covering overall security governance or API? And I think we're going to cover both, honestly, David. Yeah. Like you need to understand the overall governance to understand what it means for API. But let's get real specific here for a second. So in PCI, as you said, there's a new 4.0 standard. It's mandatory. Like the transition period ends in 2 months, or less than 2 months now. And in it, you'll see all these sort of references to APIs, to be able to look for manipulation of APIs, attacks on business logic through APIs and things like this. So there are like very specific things that are written into PCI. I think it's why it's one of our favorite regulations. But then there's like things that are a little less obvious, right? So throughout PCI, it talks about security controls and risk mitigation for, quote, custom and bespoke software, right? And I think this goes back to your concept of like knowing your assets, right? And understanding like what is the envelope of compliance, right? And so when I read DSS 4.0 and it says, you have to do vulnerability testing on your custom and bespoke software, I'm thinking that's got to include my APIs.
Absolutely.
Right? Or take FedRAMP, right? Which is, for if you're doing any cloud services for the US government, right? They just changed their standard. It used to say monthly vulnerability testing for web interfaces, right?
Oh, yeah.
And in the new version, Rev 5, it says, comma, including APIs, right? Because somehow people were interpreting that web interface meant something you could click, not something, like an API, right?
Yeah.
That is programmatic. And so I guess, David, hopefully this is somewhat helpful, which is you've got to be thinking about APIs across all of these things. Like we certainly think about encryption and our web interfaces and authentication, but we've got to be extending that to APIs. It's not just this little thing in the corner that we ignore. It's front and center now.
So let me give you another example. It is the control 2.2.7 in the PCI DSS version 4. It talks about that it is about the non-console admin access, which needs to be encrypted using strong cryptography, and that includes API. So if you look at this control, that's explicitly mentioned that API is included here. But normally the standards are not that specific like PCI DSS. So if we are talking about ISO 27001, you won't find any specific technology mentioned there or any development component. They just refer it with the term software development. So I assume, and everybody who works in the cybersecurity domain, that every component in your system development needs to be securely protected. And that control, be it in ISO 27001 or any other standard that talks about software development, has every component in scope. Yeah. So if your code includes API, then API is in scope, not just PCI DSS, but any other standard.
And it looks like I'm getting people are complaining of an echo here. Maybe I move my mic a little further. Hopefully it's not as bad. I'm gonna pop this one up from Saya. Very basic question. What are we talking about when we talk about a control? Like, can you give us some concrete examples here?
Yeah, so when we talk about controls, is any process that we introduce to mitigate a given risk. So let's say we have a risk of unauthorized access to systems. So what do we do to protect, to prevent this risk from materializing? We implement a control such as a proper access control is in place for all systems in the company. So we make sure that the user is authorized before we create that in our environment. This is a control. Or if we talk about change management process, for example, we make sure that we have a clear process of how we handle changes inside the company. Who should raise a change request? Who should approve the change request? Should it be tested before pushing that to live? And who should do the final check, the quality assurance of these changes? So all these are controls. And those controls, as I said, exist to mitigate a given risk. And if we talk about API, there is a control that is highly suggested to be implemented is the API gateway. So companies are very much recommended to use an API gateway to manage their APIs consistently and effectively. This is also an example of a control. Or we should have a naming convention for the APIs. Yeah. We should have a proper level of encryption. We should use protocols that are effective for encryption and transmitting data. So everything that I mentioned so far are considered as controls. And a control can be complex, which is can comprise a set of controls, or it can be just a single control, a simple one, like I said, implementing an API gateway.
Yeah, spot on. I mean, you talked about 3 pillars early on. We have our own 3 pillars that we talk a lot about in our API security courses, and those are governance, testing, and monitoring. Right. And we really strongly believe you should start with governance, right? And so I think one of the biggest misunderstandings of governance, I'm going to throw this question up from Mohammed, is that, I think in some organizations, APIs are viewed as products. They're their own rightful objects and assets and things to be controlled. And in other organizations, APIs are kind of like, oh, it's just that thing that comes along as we're building our apps, but it's nothing to worry about, right? And so, like, I see this question from Mohammed: do we have to report activity across all APIs to leadership? I mean, I think you need to be treating APIs like you would anything else, right?
Well, this depends actually on the organizational structure and the complexity. So if we are talking about a cybersecurity team which has 5 people in the team, then obviously the maturity of these internal processes will not be like will not be high mature. Let's put it like this. If we're talking about a company which has like 100 plus people working in cybersecurity, then of course we would expect having a specialized team for managing APIs, for example, and obviously they would have a lead. So that would be the person in charge for managing APIs. If the question is about reporting to upper level management, which means C-level or managing directors, then the answer is clear: no. Senior managers don't want to hear any technical stuff. We need to speak business language with them. Yeah. If you can actually quantify the risk of the API being exposed to unauthorized access and bring this number to the upper level management, they will be very happy. Yeah. So this is the way how we communicate vertically, I would say. Yeah. Everything else needs to be like a lateral communication among cybersecurity folks. There is the place where you can go technical.
Well, and God, the questions are fabulous here. Thank you, everybody. And
yeah, great questions.
I hope Ejona, you're okay with me popping these in here. There's a lot about like, okay, I thought this conversation was going to be about APIs, and we're talking about kind of governance in general, but it's still all super relevant to APIs. But let's see what can we do to make it even more specific to APIs. All right, so I'm going to throw this one to you from Kokab. All right, so ISO 27001, right? Yeah. And we were talking about this before. Like some regulations are very black and white, and some are more like here's the like GDPR, right? You have to protect information. It doesn't tell you how or what methods, and you won't get a GDPR audit. But let's take 27001. Is there anything in there that's specific to APIs, or it's more a matter of like you got to take these concepts and apply them to everything, and that includes your APIs?
So in the ISO 27001, there are 2 chapters, well, more than 2, but 2 are obvious that also include API, are change management and system development. So those 2 chapters have a bunch of controls which are applicable to any internal developed tool, which includes API. You cannot exclude it, absolutely. Or to any external built tools, which also goes in the direction of supply chain management. Yeah. So in both domains, you have to include your APIs if for some reason you're operating APIs in your company. And there's also a new requirement in the ISO 27001, the version 2022, which includes also the threat intelligence. So you need to conduct a threat intelligence, like a threat assessment, in any components in your cybersecurity posture. And of course, API is part of this.
Well, and I think the key here is like in most regulations, you may see some, but probably more likely not going to see APIs mentioned by name, right? Exactly. It is not like, okay, there's now these extra requirements. In the case of PCI, they actually do. I think they really wanted to reinforce like, hey, you can't ignore this stuff. But I think the main point is like, you're not necessarily going to see API written into the regulation. You have to incorporate API into your risk assessment, right? It seems like all of these regulations kind of start with, okay, understand your risks and then build controls and processes around those risks, right? And so if you've got APIs, that has got to be part of your assessment.
But you don't have in the standards also other components like the domain controller, for example.
Right, exactly.
You won't find it, like explicitly mentioned. You won't find a web server term used in most of the standards. So why would we expect API to be included there.
I don't know. It's a funny thing.
Other component.
I remember talking to the sort of the audit, the organization or the standard creator for FedRAMP 2+ years ago, and saying, hey, where it says testing of web interfaces, does that include APIs? And they said, yeah, of course it does. And then I went to like dozens of FedRAMP covered entities, and I said, what are you doing about your API testing? And every one of them said, that's not a requirement, right? And so for some reason, I think this is changing, but for some reason, APIs have been kind of viewed as not in scope for a lot of organizations. And
well, I think auditors will come and tell you that they are in scope, 100%.
Yeah, I actually would. This is maybe a perfect segue. So thank you for this. We're actually doing a survey, and I'm going to throw it up here for a sec. If you are PCI relevant, okay, if you don't do anything with PCI, please don't fill out the survey. But we're doing a survey because we know this new DSS-4 is coming, and it's got a lot to say about APIs. And we just started the survey a few days ago. And one of the things we ask are, if you're an auditor, right, like, how important are APIs? And we're hearing answers kind of across the board, right? And even from covered organizations who are like, yeah, we're looking at it, but we haven't done anything about it. And other people are like, oh, no, this is super important. We see it's all over DSS. And I think, there's this kind of spectrum of adoption. But I think what's very clear is it's becoming more important. The auditors are going to be asking you about it. And you really need to be getting prepared for it.
They definitely will. And I've been working also in big four companies, and I've been working with many different clients, and I've seen that part of the audit program has been also the API, absolutely. And let me say some statistics that I discovered recently. So the rate of API attacks has increased 60% year over year from 2022 to 2023. And just a couple of days ago, I was reading a report from VentureBeat, which showed that 41% of the organizations had an API security incident in the last 12 months, and 63 of those involved in a data breach.
Yeah.
So if this is not a call for all organizations to implement a better API development and management hygiene, I don't know what else can be.
Yeah. I'm right there with you. I mean, the stats are really just, unmistakable. The breaches are happening. I mean, there was just one about 2 weeks ago. I won't share the name just for the hell of it, but 15 million user accounts harvested through an API that, there was a good business use for that, but they had failed to put authentication on it. Their rate limiting wasn't blocking the hundreds of millions of requests. Like, this stuff is happening all the time. Let's put this one up here because I'm actually don't know this one well enough. The NIST 853. I don't know if that's more of a U.S. centric.
That's U.S. Actually, all the whole NIST standard is mainly for the U.S. So I'm not sure if there is any API control mentioned in the NIST.
Well, I think it's like what you said, right? It's not explicit, but it's implicit, right? And I guess maybe this is a question I've always wondered. Like, you have NIST and ISO, and those are those what I would call a framework, like, as opposed to a regulation, right? Like HIPAA is a regulation, and PCI and FedRAMP, but like SOC 2, ISO 27001, like, where do they fit into all of this?
Well, there are standards for implementing an effective ISMS, Information Security Management System. Obviously, you don't have to apply those standards, but for some reason, this is becoming very attractive nowadays because people are becoming more aware of the protection of their data. They are becoming more sensitive for their data, and obviously, B2B customers are also pushing so much towards having business only with companies who are certified for any of those reputable standards. So there is a pressure coming from different directions. And I think that is also the main reason why companies nowadays choose to go with ISO certification or any other framework.
Yeah, well, when you consider like there is no audit for GDPR, there is no audit for HIPAA,
but there is a fine.
Well, yeah, exactly. If you're found, negligent, then the fines are enormous.
Absolutely.
I think 4% of revenue in the case of GDPR.
Or 20 million euros.
Yeah, easily, right? So I think these standards are a good way for you to implement the best practices. It puts a stamp on your organization. I'm going to put this one up from Mateo's. It's not a question so much as a comment. I recently found an API vulnerability which allowed me to obtain information simply by removing user ID from an HTTP request.
Oh.
This is a really remarkable story. Mateo's, maybe you can contact me and we can understand more about what you did. But this is actually not too uncommon, right? Like I think maybe for the audience, right? Like what does APIs have to do with it? Well, a lot of what we've done historically is to control our let's talk about companies with web presence. That's what we're talking about here, right? They control what data gets presented, what users can do, how we authenticate. We do all that at the UI layer, right? And the UI is highly locked down and you can't really, go outside. We test it for injections and things like that. But then what hackers do is and in this case, like Mateo's, they go around that UI and they hit the API directly, where they discover far less controls, more access to data, access to functionality that you couldn't access within the UI itself. And this just reinforces the why APIs matter to governance, why it matters to compliance, why it matters to just keeping our organization safe, right? And it's almost like a view shift that needs to happen, which is, we can't rely on the old ways of just locking down the front end because that's all the user could see. We're now exposing all this functionality through APIs as well, and we have to have the same level of controls. And like in the case here from Mateo's, clearly, that API was left wide open, had access to too much information. And if you aren't considering that in your risk assessments, in your awareness of your assets and implementing your controls, you are just opening yourself up to all kinds of exposures and breaches and the like.
Absolutely. Well, hackers are usually after personal data or money. And API is a perfect target because it just offers those in massive volumes. So I would compare the API with the aorta, just as aorta ensures the blood reaches every corner of our body, the API flows the data across various systems and components. And if somebody has access directly there to the source, then the impact is devastating.
Yeah. So this one from Gibran, I think it's a big question, but I think it gets to the heart of it. Like, what's this balance, right? So let's read it real quick, right? In the context of evolving cyber threats, increasing sophistication of attackers, how do you approach the balance between robust security measures, API security measures, and ensuring API performance, right? And the ability to run the business, right? And not become a friction on the business, right? So Ejona, like this is kind of like the killer question, right? Like, how do we find that balance? What kind of advice do you have for organizations? Because you can't lock everything down 100% and
absolutely
run a business.
Absolutely. So this is purely a governance topic, and that's a great question. Actually, what should we do is, first of all, stipulate what is the risk appetite of the organization. That's the very first step. And that is not a cybersecurity decision. That is a management decision. So how much risk is the company willing to accept in order to still continue to be on the business? So this is the risk appetite. And based on that risk appetite, then we know in which lanes can we navigate. So if a company is risk adverse and they say, no, I don't accept any risk related to data breach or unauthorized access, obviously, then we would implement like very powerful controls. I would say also aggressive controls in place, because we don't want this risk to materialize.
Yeah.
But if the company says that, yeah, I'll be fine with losing, I don't know, X millions of dollars or euros within this timeline, then we'd think about it. Like, what are the effective solutions in place which could protect us from experiencing a data breach? And if we can negotiate maybe to reduce the cost, and also consider the element of a better user experience. By the way, the product team will push so strongly in this direction, because every department has their own targets. So the product team wants to make the product more easily accessible and have a nice user experience and so on. We need to protect the product to say that we're offering a product which is safe and secure. So there are different approaches here, and the best approach is, as I said, to know what is the risk appetite of the company, and then based on that we sit down with different stakeholders and decide what is crucial, what is something that we cannot negotiate, and then what is something which is nice to have.
Well, and I think I see the comments here and from Scott and so forth, like like these controls may feel like the brakes on the business, but they actually are enablers, right? It enables the business to run faster. So, for example, right, and I'm back to Gibran's second question, like what are some best strategies and approaches and so forth? Like a lot of organizations test their APIs, right? But they're testing for functionality, performance, right? Does it do what it's supposed to do? But we don't do a whole lot of negative testing, right? And does it not do this? Does it not do that? Right? And the more we can do that, the more confidence we can have in the security of our APIs, of our applications, and the protection of our data. That frees us up to actually be more aggressive about the kinds of business things that we can do. And so, to your second half of your question, Gibran, we at APIsec are big believers in this governance monitoring or governance testing monitoring approach, right? Like define your policies and understand your risks and, define your controls, test to make sure that those APIs are going out free of vulnerabilities. You've done your own, sort of self-hacking or pen testing or whatever you want to call it, right? Make sure you monitor to look for threats that are happening as they're occurring. But that is actually going to give you more confidence to be able to operate your business.
And I would say there are some controls which don't necessarily cost money and don't cause any user inconvenience. For example, implementing rate limits and quotas to prevent the API abuse. Like, why should we not do that? Is there any reason from user perspective, user convenience, or something that could prevent us from doing that? And that is an example. We have a bunch of other controls which do not actually impact the user experience or cause any additional cost to the business.
And I think we're running short on time, and my God, we didn't even get close to answering everything. So for everyone who's asked a question, we will personally reach out to you, follow up, try our best to answer your question. A comment from Scott, forget, I guess, legacy firewalls, EDRs, all these kinds of things. I mean, I think the point is like we have a lot of legacy technology that don't really speak API language, right? Or aren't savvy to API types of threats and risks and so forth. I think it's changing, right? I know a lot of firewall vendors are really actively implementing API specific algorithm discovery, that kind of thing. But I do think it's really important that you don't just trust that the stuff you've got is somehow going to keep you protected from API risk, right? You got to treat what we've seen over and over again is API attacks look different. They're not your classic SQL injection attack or cross-site scripting or any of these kind of common things. And so you need different technologies, different approaches. We are big fans here of testing, right? We think that you should find the vulnerabilities before attackers do, and that should happen ahead of production. And if you're releasing code 52 times a year and you're testing it twice a year in a pen test, that's not going to work, right? You've got to look at automation and continuous assessment and the like. Ejona, I know we had a bunch of things we wanted to get through. Did we miss anything that you wanted to make sure we talk about in today's session?
Well, I would also focus a little bit on a message that I wanted to give to everybody working, especially in cybersecurity governance. We need to work towards becoming better communicators, speak business language, and build cyber resilience, because we are seen absolutely as a business accelerator,
Yeah.
in a way that we are like telling the business that, look, your product is not good enough, you need to implement this and that. On the other hand, then we spend a lot of money on cybersecurity tools, which are not cheap. And we are seen as a cost center. But nowadays, the concept is gradually changing, because people are like customers want their data to be protected. And of course, they value these security elements that we introduce into the products.
Yeah.
So imagine a brand new car with a CEO at the steering wheel and business leaders and the CISO as passengers. Now, the business leaders are eager to speed up, of course, and they say, let's hit 300 kilometers per hour. We can reach them faster and beat the others. And the CISO, on the other hand, is cautious and is the one who says, no, we shouldn't exceed 80. It's too risky. However, the CISO could conduct a detailed risk analysis and determine that, it is safe to drive 140 on this particular stretch and then go down to, 80 on a dangerous road. So this is known as cyber resilience. It means not slowing down the business unnecessarily, but rather making informed and risk-based decisions, which of course align to the company risk appetite.
Yeah, it's a crucial concept, right? And I love that analogy. One of the challenges you talk about being able to communicate. I think one of the biggest problems we have is CISOs get bombarded with vendor this, vendor that, right? And they don't want to hear it. And they say, well, talk to my team, right? They're the ones that actually are on the front lines and so forth. And then the front team, you talk to them and they're like, well, the CISO hasn't made it a priority, so we're not doing that. Or, and there's this kind of like
friction,
like CISOs want to empower the team below, but the team below doesn't feel empowered. And I really think we need those people who are on the front lines, who are seeing the threats, because the CISO can't know everything, to be able to vocalize and to share and to explain in CISO language what these risks are, right? And we know that APIs aren't being taken seriously enough. And I think the people who are on this call, are probably the people who need to be, shining a light and making the case for we've got to take this seriously.
Absolutely. I mean, we definitely need a better communication, especially the communication of risks in business terms.
Absolutely. And I noticed here a lot of comments on testing. I got to put a plug for APIsec.ai. Yes, it's the company I work for when I'm not wearing the APIsec U hat, which is 99% of the time. If you want to learn how to test with automation and AI, please come check out APIsec AI. I'm going to wrap up here, and I can already hear my voice echoing. I don't know why that's happening again. But I want to make sure that you all know how to find Ejona. There is her LinkedIn profile. So please check her out, follow. She's really just an incredible leader in the cybersecurity space, and you will learn a lot by keeping track of her. And we do have a, how do I do this? We do have a webinar coming up. So I got to put a plug for our next webinar, which is in 2 weeks from today. We're going to do a PCI API security readiness workshop. So very timely, right? We know that the ESS is coming up in just a couple of months. And let me put the link up here. Share that. All right, there you go. If you click that link, you can actually register for our webinar. It's on February 22nd, so about 2 weeks from, I think, Thursday. And we're going to talk about DSS 4.0. We're going to talk about what's in there. So if you want to get really, really concrete about API requirements in a regulation, and specifically PCI, please come check that out. And with that, Ejona, I just want to really thank you again for being here, and really enjoyed the conversation. I think this is the most active chat I've ever seen. It was hard to keep up with everyone's questions. Thank you all for joining, as always. And
thank you so much. It was a real pleasure to be here and interact with APIsec University, and also, of course, speak with you. It's always a pleasure for me.
Yeah, we appreciate it. Thanks, everyone. Hopefully we'll see you in a couple of weeks. And until then, stay safe. We'll talk soon.
Bye-bye.